Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar panel. I'm going to give folks a few minutes to join. Again, this is a panel on university transit equity for student mobility. We have a great group of panelists. I am Austin Stanion. I'm the moderator today. I'm the manager of solutions engineering over at Transloc. Previously worked at the Los Angeles Metro and City of Los Angeles. So try to bring both the public transit perspective as well as transit technology perspective to these conversations. See the participant number growing. Welcome everyone. If you would like, please feel free to type your name and organization in the chat, maybe where you're calling in from. It's always cool to see where in the country and where in the world people are joining from. And also, I think helps the panelists know who's in the audience, what are audience members going to be most interested in. So, we can make sure we have a relevant conversation around that. So yeah, feel free to jump into the chat. There's also a Q&A feature. So once we start the session, if you have a question based on the conversation, please feel free to type a question in Q&A. If you type your question in the chat, we may miss it. It may get buried, but the Q&A, it's a pretty easy way for panelists and also myself as the monitor to track who asked what and make sure we answer the questions that get asked. And finally, there will be a few polls over the course of the session. So please feel free to respond. Interactivity, and again, gives us a better idea of who's in the audience, what are relevant topics. I'm seeing some folks introducing themselves in the chat. Great to see everyone. So we got some Metrolink representatives. I used to ride Metrolink out of Los Angeles. Amazing service down to San Diego, beautiful views. So with that, I think we can go ahead and start introducing our panelists. So Tyler, could you please introduce yourself and your background?
Absolutely. My name's Tyler Dewey. I'm representing Duke and Duke Transit this morning. I'm the TDM lead and associate transit planner here at Duke. I've been in this role since fall of 2019, so got in right before the pandemic really started to hit. And I come from a background of actually bike advocacy. I was the executive director of a bike advocacy organization that worked for trying to get low-income members of the community a way to get around town via a free bicycle and ongoing maintenance. Now here at Duke, in some ways it's a different population, but it's a similar concern in trying to figure out how we can get folks who may not have the same access to a private vehicle, and how we can make sure that they still can get everywhere they need to go and make sure that their mobility needs are addressed.
Thank you, Tyler. Heather.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Heather Hume. I'm with the MBTA here in Boston. I am the Director of Transition for the Fare Transformation team here in Boston. And I've got about 22 years in public transit service. I actually started my career as a bus operator for the University of Massachusetts. So still holding my CDL, still a proud bus operator, but have a very long career in both fixed route operations as well as paratransit operations, mobility management, as well as a number of other technological projects. Currently at the T, as I am working as part of the Fare Transformation project, I like to say that my team are the people. And so we are responsible for ensuring that all 6,500 employees are well-versed and educated in the changes we're making as we upgrade and advance our fare collection system, as well as responsible of educating and communicating with about 500,000 individual riders pre-pandemic every single day, and ensuring that they are ready and able to adopt the new fare collection system as we bring it online.
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, those CDLs are more valuable today than ever. And so hopefully we get time to dive into the operator perspective, because that's, I think, often overlooked, but ties everything together in these conversations. Next on our panel, Ashley, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, hey everyone, my name is Ashley Schultz. I am Transloc's Manager of Project Implementations. So work a lot on the operations and service delivery side of our organization. I'm bringing a lot of experience prior to Transloc and bicycle and pedestrian consulting and first and last mile access to transit, as well as community engagement for a regional transportation authority that worked really closely with a lot of universities in the Triangle area.
Thank you, Ashley. And finally, Cicely, would you introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, my name is Cecily Zhu. I am the Sustainable Transportation Program Manager at Penn State. I've been in my role for almost 7 years now. The main goal of my role is to reduce traditional single occupancy vehicle travel on campus and related greenhouse gas emissions. So programs like biking, transit, which is a huge one, pedestrian safety, access to alternative fuels like EV charging stations, things like that. Everything kind of falls under my purview. Before working at Penn State, I also I worked in Pittsburgh for a couple of years doing some transit equity work, some corporate sustainability work. So kind of dabbled in a few different fields there.
Awesome, thank you. And I do want to shout out Morgan at CoMotion, who is in the background, but making all this possible. And so we're covering 3 topics today, the first of which is about collaboration between universities and public sector transit partners, whether it be municipalities or regional transit agencies. Often universities are not acting in a vacuum. They have other partners nearby. And so, Morgan, if we can launch the poll question about, does your university collaborate on operations or share funds? Or I guess this is an icebreaker question to start. So what is your role in university transit? So we can see sort of who's in the room, and then we can go from there. And while that poll is coming in, Tyler, I wanted to ask you about an impressive project that happened here in Durham, North Carolina, called the Bull City Connector. Durham is known as the Bull City. And if you could give us a little bit of a background on what that project was, what was the collaboration like between the university and other partners, and what were some of the outcomes and learnings from that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Austin. The Bull City Connector was really a unique project, and I was actually looking at some of the documentations from the early years of it. So it was a single route that was sort of distinct from the rest of the system, with the goal of being fast, frequent, and free. And the idea was really to connect Duke, downtown, and East Durham. So, it started in 2010. And so, the idea was like, how can we get more people downtown? How can we get more Duke faculty, student, staff between downtown and Duke? And also, how can we boost mobility for residents of the East Side, which is a traditionally disadvantaged community? So big goals for one route. And so it ran sort of as a circulator, fare free, that would sort of go on a line back and forth from Duke to the west and East Durham to the east. And the route changed over the years. So initially it came through the Durham station, which is just a few blocks from downtown. Unfortunately, separated from downtown by foot, you have to go under a pretty tight bridge. It's not the best pedestrian environment. So initially it came through Durham station to facilitate a lot of transfers and enable people to take other routes. And then, it shifted over the years as people really wanted sort of that fast connection across east to west. So they try to streamline a lot of the route to get a stronger, quicker connection. And then eventually as we got closer to 2020, the route sort of dissolved. And I think it, in many ways, the dissolution shows the challenges and opportunities of university transit. There are different goals for university. Oftentimes they overlap, but sometimes they differ, and they might differ from the other riders on the route. So we had, folks on the east side, they had mobility needs, and maybe they didn't all need to go just on one line over to Duke. They needed the route to go in other places. Duke students, faculty, and staff, they needed the route to perform in certain ways. And I don't think those needs ultimately could all be met by one route. And so in many ways, the funding that was used to create that fare-free route was spread out to meet goals on other routes. So, we saw from Duke, on the Duke side, it's like we want, more service directly to the heart of campus. And so we took some of that funding and Go Durham and the regional provider Go Triangle increased frequency on one of the main routes, core routes that was already existing, but we increased frequency on that route so that there's 15-minute service between downtown Durham Station and the heart of campus. The east side similarly wanted increased service to more locations at a faster rate, so they boosted up the frequency of some of those other routes. So it was also, even as it dissolved, it was like, how can we take all of these stakeholders and improve the service for them? And maybe we do it by improving other routes rather than focusing on this one route.
Thank you for sharing that, Tyler. And we do have results of the first poll, with the winning result being other. So now I'm curious as to who all is represented, but including a few administrator students and technology vendors. So with I had the opportunity to ride the Bull City Connector a few times, and I remember a big part of it was also connecting the hospitals. Duke has huge hospitals that are a major employer in the region. And I think that's something that many universities, especially larger universities, have to contend with, is balancing the priorities of student mobility, staff mobility, hospital mobility, hospitals often have very different hours and needs than the rest of the campus population. And then, the city outside of the campus, when you're talking about a project like the Bull City Connector. Cecily, I'm curious about how Penn State has navigated that, sort of student mobility versus hospital mobility versus sort of, staff and the wider city. I know that's something that you think about a lot.
Sure. Yeah, the Penn State's location makes for a very interesting, I guess, topography for housing opportunities, and cost of living closer to campus is obviously way higher than if you were 20 minutes out in like nearby satellite towns. And then in between we have like state forest and game lands, which there's no housing. So in order for our transit operator CATA to evaluate the most efficient use of their transit stock, they really have to look at ridership. And sometimes, for example, one of the satellite supporting communities is Bellefonte. They had cut down their route there to like maybe twice a day, like just once in the morning and once in the evening, which is not great. It's very limited. So then they actually implemented this thing called CATA Go, which is a on-demand type of service, so that they could have more flexibility and reallocate also that 40-foot bus to another route that needed that density, and then utilize a smaller kind of van shuttle on-demand service for that location. It's been doing really well, and I applaud them for implementing. It's a pretty like new innovative solution for that type of situation. But just there's so many situations that need unique solutions like that, that it's kind of an ongoing discussion between the university and our transit operator. There have been other, other situations where we've seen a lot more growth within the downtown surrounding area directly adjacent to campus. So a lot more, again, like student housing going up there, which is great that they're within walking distance of campus. But when, the third party apartment developers are utilizing our free campus circulators as a way to attract folks, it kind of makes it difficult for planning in trying to account for that sudden increase of ridership along those points in downtown. But it's kind of just figuring out what routes work best, what where we can have these stops where we're not impacting, traffic and traffic flow downtown, and just making sure that people don't get left behind too in the more, the areas that really need this transit service, or just people who just don't feel like walking 2 blocks. Really just trying to balance that out. Sorry if that's a little vague, but I have like a billion different scenarios kind of going through my head.
Sure.
Right now.
No,
Yeah.
the private developer example is an interesting one. I think in transit planning, we often talk about the disconnect between transit planning and land use, and how those are often different departments, and sometimes it's even a different entity entirely, with a regional transit provider versus a city controlling the land use. And at universities, I think universities often have pretty strong control over the built environment on their campus, but as soon as you get off campus, the university has very little influence and no control. So they might be running routes and have no say in where development is going in or not going in. So that kind of just exacerbates a common problem in public transit. I want to launch our next poll. This one is on collaboration. Does your university collaborate on operations or share funds with local municipalities? Or if you don't work for a university, maybe one nearby, or any that you've worked in the past, any examples you have, I think will be good. And I want to invite Heather or Ashley, if you have interesting examples of collaboration with universities outside, or best practices that you've seen. I'd love to hear it.
Ashley, do you mind? Okay. I was thinking both my role here at the T in Boston versus my previous role at UMass, 2 very different environments, both heavy university settings, but very, very different. UMass is, I think it's 60,000 students. It's a very, very large campus. It's its own garage of a regional transit authority out in Western Mass. There's 15 routes. It's all student run. And most of the operating costs are covered through student fees charged through the university and the 5 college consortium, which is out in Western Mass. So Amherst College, Hampshire, Mount Holyoke Smith, and UMass all participate in that. And it's a very, very well-run system. Started back in 1969, been student run the entire time, and it serves both the university students, but also the community as well. No fare boxes on board. I think now you do have to show your university ID, but been typically, no fares, barrier free in that regard, and really serving the community as a whole. I mean, the system starts at 5 a.m. and ends at 1 a.m. And like I said, it's a significant system for the region that it is, and it serves the university specifically. Versus my current role at the MBTA, where Boston is known as the sort of one of the university capitals of the country, but the dynamics between the universities and the T are very, very different. The T is really focused in on serving the general public. I'm always telling folks and students, I teach transportation policy at the School of Public Policy at Northeastern. And I bring the students out to Ruggles Station, which is the main station on campus. And, you know, anywhere in that given area, you've got a commuter rail, you've got, you're standing between the orange line and the green line, you've got a whole bus hub. But not only that, but you have an entire nonprofit transit system, which is, they just changed the name from Longwood Medical to the Longwood Collaborative, which serves the medical communities, a lot of the universities, and are very targeted and focused in on that demographic, because the T has not been able to serve that, and they can do it better and more specifically. But it's amazing on how much transit is going on around any student at one time, and how little the students know of, oh, can I get on that shuttle? How do I use the commuter rail? How do I do this? A lot of students don't even realize that they can get a discount on their semester pass or a university pass. A lot of different things, a lot of different dynamics. So I think, you know, when you talk about universities and cities, you know, they have to be very focused in talking about that need and ridership and cost, and making sure that they're serving their students, where, you know, somewhere like UMass, you can be a little bit more broader and serve the community as a whole. And I think there's always a push-pull there.
Yeah, and Heather, I'd love to, and Tyler, I see you've got your hands raised. I'd love to hear from either of you. Partially in response to our poll results, that most of the, or I guess half of the respondents said that their university transit is not integrated with local transit. So my question, I guess, to any panelists here is, what are the barriers for collaboration? I think we all see the potential benefits in collaboration, but what's getting in the way?
I just want to chime in real quick, because I think one of the real positives for transit in the Triangle region is that through various transportation demand management grants, there's actually a group of us who is made up of many of the local universities, the main regional transit provider, and the Council of Governments meet at least once or twice a month, every month throughout the year. So it's a great way to have everyone sort of come together and sort of discuss what issues we're having, what successes, what things are working, what things are not, and sort of talk through these issues. It also allows us to the best we can, be on the same page in terms of our messaging. So like when the regional transit provider is having sort of a promotion, I think in September, we're gonna be talking about carpool and tri-transit. You know, everyone, the university partners can also be sharing that same message, which I think is a real big benefit. I think one of the challenges is, especially, I know speaking for Duke, you know, when it comes to talking about operations, is perhaps the university's overarching goals may be different than the specific goals and needs of transportation, for like transit transportation. And I'm thinking specifically, you know, recently Duke had the issue of a light rail project not moving forward, in part because of a decision made by Duke University, where there may have been a difference in goals between the university at large and some of the transportation transit goals.
Thank you, Tyler. Any other thoughts on sort of what stops collaboration before we move on to our next topic?
Hey, I just wanted to add one thought, and it's kind of along the lines of what Tyler was just talking about, but I think we've been discussing universities and other transportation providers, but I think there is a little bit of a nuance that speaks to some of the challenges in universities collaborating with transportation providers, municipalities, et cetera. And I do think there can be a difference in how they collaborate based on if the university is a public university or private university, and what their funding opportunities or requirements are, what political things are happening and who they need to play nice with, or how much extra power they have for whatever their status is. And I think all of those things play together when particularly in areas where you have multiple different universities that are collaborating and may have different goals and contexts that they're working within. Then you introduce different transportation providers that also have their own goals too. So there's a lot of opportunity to collaborate and get on the same page, but there's also a lot of nuance in relationships and expectations.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I'm really interested in that dynamic of power. Universities and with other entities, universities are often major employees in major employers in a region. So regional governments, want to make sure that they are, keeping major employers happy and and want to see those jobs and make sure people can get to those jobs. So let's move on to our next topic. We've set the stage of what's going on at a higher level with university transit collaboration, but what are the impacts on riders? And our next topic is inclusivity and equity in campus transit. So how do these decision makers, these collaborations, however they pan out, how do they impact riders? And Cecily, I wanted to invite you to speak to your experience at Penn State regarding your system's riders and decisions that your team has had to make about student mobility versus the mobility of staff at Penn State.
Yeah. So, I talked about this a little before, but our relationship with our transit operator, CATA, is, it's a partnership. So with there being a limited number of transit stop, we have to make sure that we're meeting the needs of campus as well as the community. So with students living closer to campus and employees living further away, we recognize that not everyone can use certain community routes to get to campus, but they can at least utilize, the circulators that we have on campus once they get here. So like promoting a park once mentality for the people that have to drive, or if there isn't a convenient route or timetable that works for them, providing other transit options once they get to campus itself. So it's not only about, the commute. Offering programs where we have subsidized passes for our employees and grad students. CATA actually has a really great program with a bunch of the larger apartment complexes in the area that cater to undergraduate students. And typically, a lot of our international students, when they're looking for housing opportunities, end up in these apartment complexes. So it helps connect them directly to transit access from the get-go, because it's just included as part of their lease. So kind of like a two-part answer where, socializing the idea like, hey, transit is accessible, along these routes in these communities, but if you can't access it, these are your other options. And I mean, in terms of inclusivity, just thinking about like ability levels and other limitations, making sure that our live feed apps, are available so folks can make, informed decisions about what works for them that day, having ADA accessible audio assistants at larger hubs on campus, and those visual tickers, depending on which what works for you. There's so many facets to inclusivity there that I could go on for a while about that, but
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm curious, something I've been trying to wrap my head around in preparation for this panel, and I'm curious if anyone has thoughts. When we talk about equity in transit, I mean, this is a conversation we've been having and we need to continue having. And I'm curious, a question for any of the panelists: how does equity in campus transit or equity for students, how is it similar or different to equity and when we talk about public transit or a public provider? What different dynamics are at play, or where are the overlaps that are still very much the same? Heather, did you want to address that one?
Do we have 5 hours to discuss that? I think, I mean, I think outright, as I mentioned before, UMass Transit completely free, mainly paid for those students, but available to the entire community. That's one where everybody has access and everybody has the ability to do it. It's also a much more rural community, so I think you can get away with those kind of things. I think when you think about the T and access and equity, you think about where most of the universities are. They're mostly on rapid transit lines. They have really, really high end, I will say, transit versus, I would wager a guess that a lot of the university students are not taking buses unless it's a rapid transit line that we have. And so when you think about equity, I think one of the things is we're having a huge debate about free bus in the city of Boston, and talking about, do we make buses free, or do we invest our time in creating means tested fares? And now university students are not necessarily, or more than likely not in that dynamic as much. But if universities are pitching in, it helps us to be much more flexible in meeting the demands for the general community as a whole, which I think is a fascinating sort of dynamic that I think, unless you have a city as large as Boston, again, UMass is much more smaller, much more contained. It can meet the needs through sort of student fees. So.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on how campus equity is similar or different than other ways we talk about transit equity?
Well, I think in some ways it gets back to that question you raised of power. And I think the timescale is also different. So like on a university, well, just in general, like I always think of equity. There was a Chicago bike advocate who defined it pretty simply and just saying like equity is those who need the most get the most. And when you're defining that as a university, even in a university like private university like Duke, there are a lot of students who are low income, don't have access to a vehicle, come from marginalized groups, are living in parts of town that is not served by transit. And so, they have true and desperate mobility needs. But, that individual student might only be in town for 4 years. And then when you're looking at the city in a whole, they're looking at neighborhoods and communities that have been disadvantaged, disinvested in, and ignored for decades and hundreds of years. So it can be difficult to juggle in talking to a university student on why the bus may come by their apartment complex every 30 minutes. It can be difficult to explain, well, the town is focusing on meeting other transportation needs that may be even slightly greater. So like oftentimes there may be overlap in the communities we're trying to serve, but I think that time scale matters as well, where it's like the community, the city might be working with communities that have had a need for quite a bit longer.
Yeah, I feel like similar to what I was saying earlier, it's so contextual, like the end definition of how we're serving people equitably is, or could be the same, but the context of, a university is serving their students. They may not be considering everyone in the entire community, depending on their relationships with other transportation providers, as we outlined earlier. And that, is exclusionary for those people that are not students. Or they may be in a very tight partnership with a transportation provider, and the goal is we provide service for everyone. So I think some of those elements of the relationship of who's providing the service influence the definition of what do we consider equitable service, and who are we considering our riders are the people that we want to have the most impact on.
Yeah, thank you. So I think within this topic, when we think about inclusivity on transit, LA Metro a few years ago came out with a study about like how women use transit, and how way too often in transit planning, there's this bias towards this sort of stereotypical man who goes to work 9 to 5, and we build our systems around that, even though most transit riders don't look like that, and that our transit planning often really ignores the fact that women often use transit differently. And there's more trip training, and also perceptions of inclusion and safety can be very different. So I wanted to launch our next poll question on what makes you feel safe or unsafe on your university or local transit system. And this one is open-ended, so feel free to write a short answer. And I'm curious to see what we will get here. But I think, universities are often very laser focused on their student safety. Students are younger, students can be more vulnerable, and especially if students are having to commute off campus, after a late night class or a late night studying, there's real safety concerns. Cecily, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, it's just, as you're talking about that, it reminded me of a situation where it was brought up to us by one of our student representatives. We have a student transportation commission with like different student representatives from different groups, undergraduate groups, graduate professionals, off campus, on campus. And this one student was telling us it's a little weird when the drivers, they switch off drivers and they have to like go into like, one of the routes goes into like a depot. And like, if you've never been on that route, you're like, where am I going? Like, where is this bus taking me? So we just hadn't really thought about that. And like that route had been running that way for years. And I even wrote that, but because I'm used to it, I knew, oh, this is normal. But from a student safety perspective, especially if you're like the only person on that route, that could make for a very uncomfortable first riding experience. So really the change was pretty simple, just having the driver say, hey, we're doing a driver handoff, just letting people know like what's happening instead of just kind of leaving them to their own thoughts and devices in that situation.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced that shock where the bus goes, takes a slight detour, does something unexpected, and all of a sudden I'm in panic of, is this the right bus? Am I going where I think I'm going to go? What do I need to do in this moment? Heather, I saw you came off mute.
Yeah, thinking about the driver change, and I certainly have taken that for granted for decades, but I think one of the things to be cognizant about thinking about safety is the knowledge and knowing, that the route takes a detour, or being educated that, hey, I'm switching off. But in a lot of cases, for a lot of students, going to university is probably the first time that they're ever experiencing riding a bus, using public transit, how to pay their fares, who can I talk to? Can I talk to the bus operator? Is there a place I can go if I need help? I think that, I've even experienced it in just Boston alone, when I've had someone acting up in a subway car and getting out at the next stop and walking up to the operator and telling them. And I remember my aunt going, what are you doing? And I'm like, yeah, you just tell them, like they'll call somebody down in a second. And that knowledge base. So I think for a lot of students, when they're first coming onto campus, it's that education of, here's the bus, this operator's here for you. At UMass in the late evening, we actually had police officers that rode around on the buses. Just Friday and Saturday nights get rowdy, I think, at a lot of universities. So we actually had police officers that rode around in the evenings as well. But that education, that just even knowing, like, this is what the bus does, this is where I'm going, this is how it works. If something goes wrong, what can I do? What are my rights and responsibilities? I think is hugely important to everybody feeling safe when they're using transit.
Thank you. And I do want to take a look at our poll results, and we also have a question that I think is going to be very relevant as well to these results. So Morgan, I don't know if we have a way to show some of the answers to the poll. Well, we'll see if we can get those. But there's also this question that came in, and I encourage everyone to read it in the Q&A. I'm going to try to paraphrase it. There's a lot of information here, but essentially studies show around the world that young women and university-aged women experience heightened levels of sexual harassment on transit and public transportation. This can have consequences. For instance, women may not want to take the night courses if they don't feel safe. What measures are you putting into place, or what measures can universities put into place to ensure women's safety in university transit mobility? And I think this, gets to the core of a gender equity issue, which is if women don't feel safe taking transit or taking transit at certain times, that's not an equitable system. That is not serving all riders the way that they need to be served. So any responses of what you are currently doing in your systems, or what can be done to address issues of safety, harassment, to make sure that female riders feel as included in the system as any other rider?
And I'll politely push back and just say that everybody should feel safe, whether you're female, you're male, or non-binary. And I want to be very clear about that, because safety is an equitable item across, no matter what gender or how you identify. So I think, harking back to my previous statement, I think a lot of what universities can do is educate their students when they first get on campus of how to use a bus, what is safe, where can you go, who can you reach out to. All those things are really important.
I think this is one area where sometimes it may be easier for a university in the university system to make certainly the appearance of safety, or the feelings of safety, and that I think it's probably easier for a university in many respects to add lighting. We can change stops very easily. If we hear complaints from students like, oh, I don't like where this stop is, it's a little too dark, we could add lighting, or we could change a stop much more easily than a public transit system can make those changes. We can also supplement our service late at night with university provided on-demand service. We have a much smaller footprint to say, oh, if you don't feel comfortable taking the bus, we'll provide you with a van to come and take you from your academic building back to your apartment. And I think, one of the areas where, collaboration with the public entity is really key is making sure that those types of trips are also available for the student if they're going to anywhere else but the university. So are they still going to be, their needs still going to be met if they're going from their apartment to the grocery store or to the bank or things like that? And I think that's where the conversation even can get really complicated and really difficult, because in some ways I know, in talking to my students, perhaps they take for granted how responsive a university transit system can be, and they wonder why the public transit can't be as responsive, because they've gotten used to sort of a level of service that is unrealistic for a public entity to provide. And you have to talk and educate the student about those challenges as well.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on encouraging safety and inclusivity in campus transit, or for students in general?
I'll add that I think one, particularly about the safety component, but I think this applies to inclusivity as well, is really incorporating those voices into your decision making and planning, and not just in terms of your typical community engagement, where should we put lighting, but is it even lighting in the first place? Or is there a larger issue? Or is there a larger issue of sexual assault happening on the campus that needs to be addressed at other levels too? What other partners need to be involved? Because many safety and security issues, yes, on the vehicle, that's really important, and those changes need to happen. And I think those voices need to be included to make that happen in the right way. That's actually going to change how people feel. But it's often also the built environment that's on the campus or where you're coming from, the lighting from your residential area to the bus stop, or other components that it's not always just one provider, the transportation provider, that influences that. So having them aware of what the full issue is, or what the big picture of what makes things feel unsafe or makes people feel like they're not included in transit, then they can really work at a partnership level to solve those problems together.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's a process. It's not just any one intervention. So Morgan is posting the answers to the last poll in the chat if anyone wants to take a look. And I've read through some of them, and I think there's some interesting threads. Someone mentions that and being in an empty vehicle, or being the only person on a transit vehicle, doesn't feel unsafe, or being one of only a very few, that we generally feel safer if there's enough people around on a transit vehicle. Someone also mentioned seeing on a map where the bus is in real time. And I think this gets at one of these critical transit concepts that we often take for granted, this idea of certainty, and this idea of mitigating the uncertainty that comes in any kind of travel, and often is higher when you take transit. Of when is the bus coming? How full is the bus? When will I get to my destination? And I do think that is an opportunity for technology to step in and help build some of that certainty, where you can see the bus is coming, you can see it on the map, it's coming towards you, you can see how full it is. If you're concerned, I don't want to get on a bus that's at 100% capacity, I'll wait. You can see that. And then once you're on the vehicle, being able to track on a map, okay, like I know where I am in the city, I know where this bus is. I think it gives riders a peace of mind that I think it's easy to take for granted when transit planners are just looking at a map and plotting out services. That uncertainty element has a big impact for riders. So in our final minutes, I want to get to our last topic, which is funding sources. So we set the stage. We've talked about impact on riders, but to make any of this work, you need to be able to fund it. You need to be able to pay for it. And whether you're public or private, university or municipality, finding funds for transit is always a challenge. And I think recently there have been opportunities, but I think it's always a balancing act. Whether you're charging fares, whether you're charging student fees, what other kinds of funding you can go after. Do any of the panelists want to kick us off about opportunities they've found for funding in their organization, or examples of collaboration or sort of certain federal sources that they found useful? Ashley, I know you've worked at in transit in a number of different levels. How have you experienced either funding successes or maybe funding struggles?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think there are so many different ways that agencies can decide, or universities and transit agencies can decide to share funding or not. I know when I was at Go Triangle, we worked very closely with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and that transit system serves the entire town of Chapel Hill as well as the university, and is fully funded by the university's fees, which it's great. It's fare free. People love that about the service, but that is not replicatable for a lot of other areas in the country. So that creates a lot of challenges. I'm sure Tyler has completely different experience at Duke and challenges with working with Go Durham and Go Triangle to make their service, function and operate.
Yeah, Duke being a private university, funding, particularly for, operations and vehicle replacement, can be a challenge. We don't have same access to grants that private and state universities would have, which creates, I have to do a lot of long-term planning when thinking about how to replace buses. I was actually just sort of having a laugh because we still have some Orion buses, and if there are some, yeah, some bus.
No RTSs. Don't you have a silver side? Don't we want a fishbowl?
like,
No.
We still have a couple of old Orions, and they're old enough that we've actually, in this past year, we got some student complaints about them because they're like, man, these buses seem like very old. And if you go up on Wikipedia, Wikipedia is like, this model is discontinued, like nobody uses this anymore. And it's like, actually, we have a couple. And so we have to get creative looking for grant funds. We were luckily able to get some money from the VW, the National VW settlement. The way North Carolina is using it, they opened it up for some bus replacement funds, so we were able to do that. But otherwise, a lot of our rolling stock has to be just very long-term planning about how we can put away money to purchase new buses, which is a challenge.
Austin, let me approach your question a little differently.
Please.
I think a lot of times, I think there is funding or there is some sort of funding, but it's what am I getting for my dollar? What am I getting, right? Why does it cost so much to run a bus? Why does it cost so much to run a train? Again, if anybody wants to take my transportation policy course, I have a whole thing on sort of the differences between capital and operating funds and the whole 9 yards. But what are you actually getting for the dollar you're spending? And I think it's really, really hard for universities who are not in the business of providing transportation to understand how expensive it is to run a service. You talk about labor, you talk about one-to-one service, even we were talking about, safety and thinking about not only is it fixed route and safety, but it's also providing alternative transportation for those who can't negotiate fixed route transit. So we're talking about paratransit, we're talking about, additional services that can meet individuals' needs with disabilities and thinking about planning. There is a lot of money that has to go into running any system. And I think, universities in the business of educating. And so it's really, really hard to educate them that your dollar does X, your dollar does Y. And I don't think the transit agencies are necessarily in a great position to always be like, hey, if you give me $100,000, you're going to get this. This is your return on investment. There's a very direct sort of quantitative return on investment. You get a bus operator and a bus and a route and signs. There's also a qualitative measure that I think that a lot of times we miss that story. We miss that ability. And when we're trying to talk to any university of saying, hey, we think a consortium here of universities having a service fee for your students will not only improve the experience for your students in the university overall, but also for the community as a whole. And how do you sell that? I think that's a really, really hard thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. That it's easy to measure something like ridership, but there's so many benefits and outcomes of transit that are much harder to measure, or just can't be measured, but are still aspects of community good. Cecily, the other day you mentioned a story of a group of students who were involved in transit on campus who were actually advocating for a raise in student fees to go towards transportation, which often students do not want more student fees. But we're talking about how do you sell these things? How do you show where your dollar is going? I'm curious if you could speak to that example of these students who really got it and wanted better transit and wanted to pay for it.
Yeah, it's this actually the same group of students within the Transportation Commission. A bit of what Heather mentioned. Educating folks about this is what it takes to offer this service. With them having been involved for academic year or two within multiple planning processes, they understood, oh, okay, this is actually worth, if we raised the student fee X amount, then we get this, giving them a platform to really say this and know that we were actually listening to them, to to actually want to implement this. But the hardest part there is, getting the rest of their constituency, the rest of the student body to vote on something like that. And I think they did experience firsthand how difficult it is to educate folks on the realities of funding for these types of programs. But it gave me hope, and there's still some students who are returning this year within that group. So we're going to be continuing that conversation. But it was refreshing to hear, to hear it from them versus us saying, hey, maybe, it's always an uncomfortable situation if the administration wants to raise fees versus it being a student-driven effort. So just more education, just making our operations and everything even more transparent, and maybe a fun infographic. Like, I don't know, just getting people to pay attention to it. Yeah,
I think it's easy for any writer, but especially students, other things going on in their lives, to take for granted what's going on around them in terms of the bus operations, the transit operations, and everything that's involved with that. In our final minutes, any final thoughts on funding for transit, or how funding can contribute to more equitable campus transit, or just final thoughts on anything we've talked about today?
I think the
Heather.
more students that use the system are more likely to support other systems as they move on in their career. I always say that. And it even starts when you're in elementary school and working your way up. So I think, the more the universities can be supportive of their students using the system, you get the group at Penn State that says, hey, we want to raise our fees because we value that. And that carries on even beyond just the university system. And that's again, a qualitative good for the community as a whole.
Absolutely.
Yeah, along the same lines, I just want to stand for university subsidized fare cards for the public system. Like, we've done that before. The Triangle during COVID went fare free, but before that, Duke was giving every student a free fare card that the student could use as much as they wanted on the regional transit systems. Faculty and staff had that for a very minimal fee, and we saw that was a really much loved program. And even now that fares have been fare free for like 2 years, people still are like, where do I get my fare card? Do I get a fare card? I want to ride the bus for free. And it's like, yeah, you do. But that was just a great program and a real nice entryway into working and collaborating with our public system.
Absolutely. And I think that there's an overlap there around education, and you may have students who hadn't been exposed to public transit before getting to a college campus, and all of a sudden, they have the fare card, they can start to learn public transit, they can start to feel more comfortable with public transit, and hopefully are able to be transit writers for life. That's what we all want. And I guess final question in our last minute, coming into the chat, obstacles disseminating information to students. I'm sure you have all experienced this. Does anyone want to take this, and then we can sign off?
I don't know if this happens with Cecily, but we really struggle. All the graduate students, and we have all our graduate students live off campus. All the departments and control the information to those students separately. So like, if we want to give information to, the graduate school, there's like no way to distribute it to all the graduate students. We'd have to go school by school by school, which is a major challenge based on the amount of staff and time that we have.
We have difficulty in reaching them, but it's more like they're very gatekeepy with what is allowed to go out to the all listserv. Like, it has to be worth it. I think another obstacle we face is, we really want to get information out there with new student orientation or like student arrival, but so is every other department out there. And so there's an arrival group that really has to limit what information the students are bombarded with. So, I mean, that's just, that might just be the nature of working on a campus with so many different services. But we're working on it, just doing like separate events and just trying to get some bandwidth there.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on though, so I get it if students are just zoned out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that should be the subtitle, the subline of this panel. There's a lot going on in transit, on campus, and at the intersection of the two. And we have come to our time. So I first want to thank all the panelists for being here, for contributing, for bringing their expertise. I want to thank CoMotion and Morgan for making this possible. I hope we can keep this conversation going. Please feel free to find me on LinkedIn or any other way you can. Yeah, thank you all so much for attending, for participating, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.